tonight.
Good evening, I'm Dawn Tan. Tonight's top stories. The drive to make public housing more sustainable. The Housing Board launches its largest solar leasing tender to install solar panels across more than 1,000 public buildings by 2026. Singapore's labour market held steady in February. Overall unemployment came in at 1.9%, unchanged from January. It also remains below pre-COVID levels. The teen accused of killing a boy at River Valley High School to plead guilty at the High Court. Now 18, he faces a charge of culpable homicide not amounting to murder. A new facility to be built to tap the growing demand for manufacturing equipment in the region as high-tech Dutch industrial supplier VDL Enabling Technologies Group moves to expand its footprint here. And employers could soon get a better idea about potential hires. SMU to introduce a transcript that documents students' co-curricular achievements and gives insights into the skill sets they've developed in the process.
I'm Lokwe. Also tonight, France's president tells his Chinese counterpart he is counting on him to bring Russia to its senses. Emmanuel Macron is in Beijing on a mission to push for peace in Ukraine and to repair frayed ties. Plus, China sends an aircraft carrier sailing off Taiwan's east coast after the island's president defied Chinese warnings against meeting with the U.S. House Speaker in Los Angeles.
And in Eurasia Business Update, India's central bank hits a pause button on its policy tightening cycle as it battles stubborn inflation and as the country's robust economic growth shows signs of easing. Plus, the economy of ASEAN countries, together with China, Japan and South Korea, is forecast to grow with domestic demand remaining strong. Singapore's Housing Board is launching its largest solar leasing tender. Now, the agency wants to install solar panels across more than 1,000 public buildings by late 2026. The project will cover flats in Aljunied, Hougang, Sengkang and Nee Soon, along with schools and other government sites.
This rooftop in Sengkang, fitted last year with solar panels, is among the more than 3,000 public housing blocks across Singapore harnessing the sun's energy to help power their lifts, lights and water pumps. In the next 3 years, the government wants to add to the count another 1,075 HDB blocks, along with schools, hospitals and community centres. The project would generate 113 megawatt peak of solar capacity, equivalent to powering 28,000 four-room flats.
On a typical basis, the common services account for about 10% of a total block's energy consumption, and 1/3 of it can be provided by solar panels, which is significant, especially in a period where energy cost is going up. So these are important steps, not just because of sustainability reasons, but also I think a win-win outcome for residents as well as the industry.
EDP Renewables APAC is one of the companies eyeing a bid. It's not a newcomer to the market, having won a previous tender to install 170,000 solar panels across public sites. Now it wants to go beyond rooftop installations.
We are looking at other available areas, such as hanging solar in between blocks, such as testing out putting solar on vertical walls, so that really to maximize the very land scarce limited Singapore, and trying to put as much solar into each of these housing estates as much as possible.
HDB has set a solar target of 540 megawatt peak by 2030, enough to power the equivalent of 135,000 four-room HDB flats a year.
Singapore's labour market held steady in February. Overall unemployment rate came in at 1.9%, unchanged from January. It also remains below pre-COVID levels of 2.2%. The resident unemployment rate, which refers to both Singapore citizens and permanent residents, remains at 2.7%. Well, the citizen unemployment rate also continued to stay at 2.8%. Close to 90% of the 64,200 residents unemployed in February were citizens. Well, still, one economist says the labour market could soften slightly, but he does expect several sectors to ramp up hiring.
Much of the support from the labour demand in these areas will stem from the recovering tourism numbers. And with the gradual reopening of China, this basically means that the recovery of inbound tourism will actually continue to benefit the services sector and likely support labour demand for the year ahead.
The teenager accused of killing his schoolmate at River Valley High School about 2 years ago intends to plead guilty to culpable homicide not amounting to murder. His initial murder charge was reduced last month. Aslam Shah has more from the state courts.
Court proceedings took about 5 minutes. The accused appeared via video link from his place of remand in a white T-shirt and wore a dark blue mask. Now, he cannot be named due to a gag order because he was 16 when he allegedly committed the offence. He is accused of killing a 13-year-old schoolmate with an axe. The defence lawyer and prosecutor told the court that the accused intends to plead guilty to the charge of culpable homicide not amounting to murder. In earlier hearings, the court heard that the accused was found to be clinically depressed at the time of the incident. He had also attempted suicide before. The case will next be heard in the High Court in May, and the accused is expected to plead guilty in August. If found guilty of culpable homicide, the teen could be given life imprisonment with caning or jail of up to 20 years and a fine or caning.
One lawyer says a guilty plea in general means less time spent in subsequent court proceedings. Without it, a case will go to trial, which typically means a longer process.
The length of the trial is hard to gauge, but it usually can run into many weeks. And also, if the accused doesn't plead guilty, and let's say he's convicted after the trial, there is always the avenue for appeal. Whereas if the person pleads guilty, then there is no appeal on the conviction.
Mr. Amalat says a guilty plea by an accused shows remorse, and the judge might take that into account during sentencing. He adds that the High Court can mete out heavier punishments.
Some people take the view that the High Court judges are more experienced, they will be more understanding, so they want to be tried by a High Court judge, to be sentenced by a High Court judge. But equally, there are people who feel that the High Court judges may be stricter, so they may want to remain in the state courts.
A man was taken to the hospital after a fire broke out at a restaurant at Bukit Batok Central this morning. 2 others evacuated the Indian Muslim eatery before firefighters arrived to put out the flames. Now, these are scenes of the damage that was left by that blaze. SCDF says that the incident involved the contents in the kitchen of the ground floor unit at Block 632. The injured man was taken to Singapore General Hospital with blisters and redness on his face. Investigations into the cause of the fire are ongoing.
The High Court has ordered the chief editor of socio-political site The Online Citizen to pay a fine of $18,000. This was after finding that Terry Xu had impugned the integrity of the courts by reproducing an article which alleged that certain people in Singapore were persecuted for political reasons. The article, which was first put up in January 2021, is no longer accessible, prompted the Attorney General's chambers to begin contempt of court proceedings against Mr. Xu. In a written judgment, Justice Hu Xiaoping found Mr. Xu guilty of contempt by publishing the article on the TOC website. He had also shared the article link on TOC's Facebook page and reproduced an excerpt in a Facebook blurb. The judge has also ordered Mr. Xu not to republish the Facebook post along with the article in the future. She also made an order to fully delete the article, including the title and a statement that had replaced the content. Mr. Xu has to pay the fine within 4 weeks or serve 10 days in jail. He also has to pay 12,000 Sing dollars in costs to the Attorney General.
Vaccination operations at vaccination centres for children will be streamlined from the 17th of April. And these services will be shifted to selected joint testing and vaccination centres. The Health Ministry says that it's given that Singapore has safely transited to an endemic state of living with the virus. 5 of these children vaccination centres, which are located in areas like Jurong and Tampines, will cease operations earlier from next Saturday due to low and stable demand. Now, as such, those aged 6 months to 11 years old can then visit selected joint testing and vaccination centres, which will then offer vaccinations for both adults and children at the same location. And it's time for a break here on Singapore Tonight. But still to come, India's central bank surprises with an interest rate pause that says it's ready to act if required. And plane maker Airbus spreads its wings into the growing Asian market, doubling production capacity in the world's second largest aviation market, China.
On the next Asia First, a new dawn in the land of the rising sun. The Bank of Japan ushers in a new era as Kazuo Ueda prepares to take the helm. We'll look at the incoming governor's tough balancing act as challenging times strain the central bank's long-standing ultra-loose policy.
Farm life is unpredictable.
The house burnt down on the 19th of December.
But just by listening to nature,
what a beauty, my first ever beehive.
We can reimagine the way we grow our food.
You know, you can imagine this place 10 years from now. It's just going to be amazing, lots of fruits, lots of food.
I'm going back to my roots.
You are your own scientist. Over time, you need to observe and see what works for you.
And rethinking the role of an urban farmer in Growing Wild tonight on CNA.
Male infertility on the rise.
More men are less shy about coming forward to get tested.
A telehealth service with discretion.
We tackle men's health conditions such as erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, hair loss, and mental health.
And mirrors in the gym, friend or foe.
The mirror can be great motivation when you look right into it, but it's also a double-edged sword.
On The Pulse, Saturday on CNA.
Cryptocurrency prices crash, DeFi companies blow up, NFT scam, GameFi hack, fraud, and the Metaverse land bust. I've always wondered, is there something more behind the headlines? Web 1 and 2 have already changed how we live, work, and play. What happens when the next evolution is powered by a host of new values and technologies?
Web3 is one of the most important inventions for Asian artists.
How can we rescue Taiwan IT industry? I cannot see any solution than Web3.
Thailand missed out on the Web2 boat totally.
Now we are the fastest move in action.
I don't think we know what the next trillion-dollar businesses will be, but they are absolutely coming.
Join me as I learn from builders in Asia, building real use cases in real life.
My name is Douglas Lan. After my grandfather passed away, my family received a mysterious envelope of cash from a clan association. What are these clans?
好，歡迎大家嚟到第165屆執監聯席會議。
呢啲係互相幫助，係以前嘅人一種我哋係冇得依靠嘅時代。
I meet young Singaporeans who take me on a quest to find out. Are clans even relevant today?
他们很无助的时候，可以来会馆，让他们感觉到有一个依赖啊。
Guangzhou is my second home. 肝胆相照。Spend my childhood here, so I will continue spending my adulthood here as well.
Watch Remember Our House on demand at CNA.Asia.
This Saturday, how to invest in the next big trend in tech.
Generative AI will be impacting positively to every other potential industry that you can ever think of.
managing your home loan as interest rates rise.
The biggest fear is how high can it go?
Plus how to maximize your travel budget despite rising costs. Money Mind, Saturday at 10:30 p.m.
Welcome back to Singapore Tonight. It's time for your business news now. And India's central bank, in a surprise move, has kept interest rates on hold at 6.5% today. The markets had widely expected the Reserve Bank of India to raise the key repo rate by 25 basis points. Now, the central bank, however, indicated that it wasn't closing the door to possible interest rate hikes in the coming months if it's needed. But for now, it is concerned about turbulence in the financial sector globally as well as economic risks. Rebecca Bundan has more for us from Mumbai.
The Reserve Bank of India, or RBI, says it's pausing for now on increasing interest rates, but will be ready to act if required. Since last May, the RBI has raised the key interest rate by 250 basis points in an effort to tackle high inflation. Retail inflation in India remains above the central bank's upper target of 6%, coming in at 6.44% in February. The RBI's governor says the war against inflation has to continue, but there are worries about global financial and economic conditions.
While the recent high-frequency indicators suggest some improvement in global economic activity, the outlook is now tempered by additional downside risks from financial stability concerns.
He says the RBI's rate hikes over the past year were likely to continue to help tame inflation. The central bank expects inflation to cool to 5.2% in the current financial year, which began on the 1st of April. It's forecasting GDP growth of 6.5%.
What RBI's worries are that if they are going to increase the interest rate in a slowing economy, global economy, how will that play out for Indian GDP growth? Also, and I think the expectation is that if the growth slows down significantly, it will bring down the inflation itself.
Many businesses are relieved by the RBI's decision to keep interest rates on hold because a hike would make the cost of borrowing more expensive, which can affect expansion plans and can also impact consumer spending as it pushes up the cost of loans. But the RBI is keeping a close eye on inflation, and if it climbs, then analysts say there is the possibility that interest rates could rise soon. Rebecca Bundan, CNA, Mumbai.
The International Monetary Fund is warning of further strain to the world economy. The crisis lender says that growing geopolitical fragmentation risks damaging global growth, with those cracks mainly driven by tensions between the United States and China. The IMF says that long-term investments on things like factories or financial markets have begun to show the effects of the growing mistrust between Washington and Beijing. Foreign direct investment from the second quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of last year declined by almost 20% from pre-pandemic levels. The IMF added that emerging market economies, particularly poorer ones, are likely to see the most serious damage. It's one of the IMF's loudest warnings since the COVID-19 pandemic regarding economic damage. And the organisation also sounded the alarm on reshoring and friendshoring. Now, that refers to moving suppliers into aligned countries. It said the policymakers should carefully balance economic costs and weigh the possible spillovers to others. The economy of ASEAN plus China, Japan and South Korea is forecast to grow by 4.6% this year, led by China's rebound. Now, that's based on latest projections from the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO. It expects domestic demand in the region to remain strong, with household spending supported by rising income and lower inflation. But it also warns that downside risks remain if China recovers more slowly than expected. The banking crisis in the United States, as well as Europe, if that worsens, and the Ukraine war escalates.
Spike in energy prices can lead to high inflation, tighter monetary policy, and a deeper slowdown in the US and Europe. The second risk that we identify is the outbreak, is the emergence of a more virulent variant of COVID-19 virus. We see that as a small risk, but nevertheless, it can happen.
AMRO also called on economies to work more closely to achieve climate ambitions like net zero targets. It says that there should be better coordination in areas like cross-border energy trade, as well as the sharing of innovation and knowledge.
The region needs to employ a well-designed suite of policies for individual economies that would include fiscal policy makers using climate-smart expenditure. Central bankers can play a role by enhancing the system's ability to mobilize green finance. And between these two and with other government agencies, coordination needs to be strengthened to ensure that they come up with a credible nationwide transition strategy.
Dutch high-tech industrial supplier VDL Enabling Technologies Group is expanding its footprint here in Singapore to tap on growing demand for manufacturing equipment in the region. It's building a new facility to increase production capacity and support research and development needs. Now, that's set to be completed by the year 2029. The firm will also hire between 200 and 300 people by next year in roles like systems design and development, as well as logistics and administration.
People development is the key in our strategy of expansion. We hire a lot of locals. This is always our policy for the past 50 years that we have developed our own local talent. Definitely, then you create a lot of high-value jobs.
Speaking at the groundbreaking ceremony, the Economic Development Board's managing director also pointed out that local suppliers and service providers can stand to benefit from partnerships and business opportunities with the Dutch firm. That's as these firms account for half of the company's local supply chain.
That the overall market for semiconductor equipment is projected to grow at a very healthy CAGR of 5%. To reach a market size of US $200 billion by 2032. And this is due to increased demand for chips driven by long-term factors such as digitalization, electrification, the adoption of AI and 5G technologies.
Airbus will open a new assembly line in China, doubling its capacity in the world's second-largest aviation market. It has also formalized earlier orders for passenger jets. Now, Airbus chief signed the 2 orders during a state visit by French President Emmanuel Macron to Beijing. But there's no clarity just yet on the number of aircraft involved in the agreement. Airbus just last year reported the sale of 292 aircraft to China. But the plane contracts have to be endorsed by the Chinese government before aircraft can be delivered. There are, however, no new order deals signed, and it is being seen as falling short of some expectations before the trip. Industry sources say Airbus is continuing to negotiate new plane orders on the sidelines of Mr. Macron's trip. China accounts for up to a quarter of Airbus and Boeing deliveries in a normal year. It used to split jet purchase deals between Airbus and Boeing, but deals with the US plane maker have slowed amid rising tensions between Beijing and Washington. Economic data out today in China pointing to robust recovery. Services activity in March, that accelerated at the quickest pace in 2.5 years, thanks to improved customer demand. Now, the Caixin Services PMI came in at 57.8. Now, that beats Bloomberg estimates, and that's ahead of February's reading of 55, and the highest level that we've seen since November of 2020. A 50-point reading, of course, separates expansion from contraction. The reading was buoyed by a strong performance for new orders and the quickest expansion in new export demand on record. Notably, new export orders in the services sector grew at the fastest pace on record, as firms took on additional workers to satisfy the growing business demand. The rate of job creation was also the fastest in 28 months. The upbeat figure also echoes an official PMI release last week, which shot to the highest level in more than a decade. But some economists are doubting if the stellar economic recovery can last amid rising geopolitical tensions and financial concerns outside China.
And still to come on Singapore tonight, China deploys warships near Taiwan as President Tsai Ing-wen defies Beijing's warnings and meets the U.S. House Speaker in California. And fierce fighting between Myanmar's army and ethnic rebels sends thousands fleeing across the border to Thailand.
Don't miss the opening of the second session of Singapore's 14th Parliament. Live on Monday on CNA.
Next time on Japan Hour.
ここでのミッションは5つの将棋のシルエットを見つけて写真に収めろ。
はい、行きましょう。だいたい1キロほどございます。
1キロ。あれじゃない。
あれやん。
これ。
そこ。
ここでのミッションはカシネズメを使った商品の中から人気3位を。おいしい。おいしい。
Japan Hour, Saturday on CNA. Japan Hour is brought to you by Sumitomo Corporation, and Zip Air. Summer fares now available with daily flights. This April, stay on top of your game and live life with purpose. Keep your wellness in check.
So much gluten in everything. How does dementia develop in Asians?
As we examine the path to live a healthier life on the Pulse. Groundbreaking stories.
Ethnic armed conflict on Myanmar.
Fascinating insights and first-hand experiences. Get to know Asia from those who live and breathe the region.
More peace and quiet at Chenjuro Lake.
CNA correspondent.
Ooh, wow.
Embrace a greener life and discover earth-friendly ways of growing your own food.
Good.
The new season of Growing Wild. This April on CNA.
Updating tonight's top stories, the drive to make public housing more sustainable. The Housing Board launches its largest solar leasing tender to install solar panels across more than 1,000 public buildings by 2026. Singapore's labour market held steady in February. Overall unemployment came in at 1.9%, unchanged from January. The teen accused of killing a boy at River Valley High School to plead guilty at the High Court. Chinese President Xi Jinping says China is willing to restart exchanges with the European Union on all levels. He spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The two European leaders are in Beijing to rebuild ties and to push for peace in Ukraine. Mr. Macron is hoping to persuade Mr. Xi to help end the war in Ukraine.
Et je sais pouvoir compter sur vous, au titre d'ailleurs des deux principes que je viens d'évoquer, pour ramener la Russie à la raison et tout le monde à la table des négociations. Et nous y reviendrons dans le détail, mais nous avons besoin de retrouver une paix durable, c'est-à-dire une paix qui respecte les frontières internationalement reconnues et qui évite toute forme d'escalade. Et je crois que c'est aussi une question importante pour la Chine autant qu'elle l'est pour la France et pour l'Europe.
Live Xiong tells us how the Chinese leader has responded to Mr. Macron's appeal.
We know that even prior to this visit, Mr. Macron had placed the Ukraine war very high on his agenda, keen for China to use its influence over Russia to rein in Moscow. But we saw that Mr. Xi, in his opening remarks of that meeting, did not mention Ukraine. Also, he had this to say when both leaders met the media.
关于乌克兰危机，中方坚持劝和促谈，政治解决。中方愿同法方一道，呼吁国际社会保持理性克制，避免采取使危机进一步恶化甚至失控的行动。
Now, we know that China has adopted what is called a neutral position in this Ukraine war, and it's noteworthy in that Mr. Xi's comments to the media, he adopted very vague language, not mentioning Russia or Ukraine or other countries, even as he said that there was a need to ensure civilians would be protected and that nuclear weapons are not used. Also stopping short of condemning Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, as has been China's position in this past year. It's a contrast to Mr. Macron's statement that followed, in which he specifically said, for example, that Russia was violating humanitarian law in Ukraine. Also, it was telling that the French leader did say that while he agrees with a number of the principles that he had discussed with the Chinese side, that he hoped that in the very near future that there would be a much more demanding conversation between the two sides and with Russia, he said, to remind Moscow of these principles, that it's a matter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, perhaps pointing and signaling that Mr. Macron may have not solicited the kind of response or commitment that he was hoping for from the Chinese leader.
China has deployed naval ships near Taiwan's coast after the meeting between U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Tsai Ing-wen in California. The vessels include an aircraft carrier, which entered the Pacific Ocean for the first time. The Shandong aircraft carrier and its escort ships are training off Taiwan's east coast, and Taipei reported 3 more warships near its waters today. A large maritime patrol group has also been deployed to the central and northern parts of the Taiwan Strait.
他曾经有海航2所次，但第一次他出南海。 然后在这个位置，我们是当然好像也是训练的一环，我把它判定为这样。但是因为这个时机比较敏感，所以它造成来它是有它的用意，我们军方也在做研判。
China strongly condemns House Speaker McCarthy's meeting with President Tsai. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says Washington made a serious mistake by promoting official exchanges with Taipei. Beijing also accuses Taiwan's ruling DPP party of relying on the U.S. to seek independence.
美台相互勾连，以过境为幌子，纵容台独分裂分子在美国从事政治活动，开展美台官方往来，提升美台实质关系。此举严重违反一个中国原则和中美3个联合公报的规定，严重损害中方主权和领土完整，向台独分裂势力发出了严重的错误信号。 中方将采取坚决有力措施，坚定捍卫国家主权和领土完整。
President Tsai says bipartisan support from Washington shows the island isn't isolated. Beijing scored a diplomatic victory last month when Honduras dropped its ties with Taiwan in favor of formal relations with China. House Speaker McCarthy vowed more support for Taipei, saying that the U.S. must continue arms sales to the island.
Meanwhile, former Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou from the opposition, KMT, made an historic trip to China. With less than a year to go before Taiwan's presidential election in January, Victoria Jen explores the ramifications as politicking heats up on the island.
There's widespread speculation that the simultaneous trips by the two leaders are part of the political jogging ahead of the presidential election. Some local media claim that President Tsai's meeting with Mr. McCarthy will be a political gain for both the ruling DPP and Taiwan. It will help pave the way for deeper collaboration between both sides, particularly with the signing of the U.S.-Taiwan bilateral trade agreement reportedly close to completion. The DPP has also been eyeing closer economic cooperation with other Western nations in face of economic pressure from Beijing. It's widely seen as Ms. Tsai consolidating her legacy before stepping down next year as she reached the term limit for the presidency.
It is no secret that today, the peace that we have maintained and the democracy which have worked hard to build are facing unprecedented challenges. We once again find ourselves in a world where democracy is under threat, and the urgency of keeping the beacon of freedom shining cannot be understated.
She will be keen to make a last push to ensure the DPP stays in power after the ruling party suffered a landslide defeat to the opposition KMT at the local election late last year. Meanwhile, former Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou from the KMT is doing quite the opposite. During his visit to China, he has constantly emphasized that China and Taiwan share the same history and culture and that both sides should seek peace and not war. He stressed the importance of the 1992 consensus, which is the cornerstone of cross-strait relations, and also the guiding principle of the KMT's engagement with the mainland. Public opinion on Mr. Ma's trip, however, remains divided. Some see his visit as an effort to reduce tensions across the strait and push forward with the KMT's political agenda when he met with China-Taiwan's Affairs Office Chief Song Tao. Others criticize his trip as kowtowing to Beijing and undermining Taiwan's sovereignty. This especially when China is ramping up military pressure and continues with its solid diplomacy by establishing diplomatic ties with Taiwan's longtime Central American ally, Honduras. With the U.S.-China rivalry set to continue, Taiwan will no doubt be caught in the crossfire as the island's presidential race heats up. Victoria Jen, CNA, Taipei.
Faced with increasing isolation in the world for its war in Ukraine, Russia is turning to traditional ally Vietnam as a source for demand for consumer goods and to help Moscow boost its exports. Tanoe tells us more.
Hanoi stands among the most welcoming capitals in the world for Russian top officials these days. Russia's Deputy Prime Minister hopes to strengthen trade, economic and technology ties on his official visit to Vietnam.
Наш президент Владимир Владимирович Путин рассматривает укрепление всеобъемлющего стратегического партнерства с Вьетнамом как один из приоритетов российской внешней политики в регионе.
With more than 7 decades of relations, Vietnam considers Russia one of its closest allies.
Đây là một mối quan hệ trải qua rất nhiều cái thử thách, thủy chung, tình nghĩa. Việt Nam không bao giờ quên những người nhân dân Nga đã ủng hộ chúng tôi trong thời kỳ giải phóng đất nước.
The meeting in Hanoi is the first between the two governments since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The two sides have discussed a wide range of prospects for cooperation. This comes amid international sanctions imposed on Russia and Vietnam's dwindling export over weak demand in global markets. Vietnam and Russia have signed 2 agreements on Thursday, including one to establish Russia's Artificial Intelligence Center in Hanoi, with an ambition to make it a hub for the Southeast Asia region. At a business forum in Hanoi, Russian businesses avoided the question of how sanctions on Russia have affected their operations, but they are eager to make further inroads in Vietnam, especially setting up new energy projects and open new logistics links between the two countries to boost trade. Among the participants are Russia's largest logistics company, who set up its base in Vietnam 1 year ago.
For the 1 year, we increased the capacity of our vessels on this line 3 times. We see that the total volume of the cargo from Vietnam to Russia and other way, it's increasing also in a 2.5 or in a 3 times.
Some Vietnamese companies see potentials that stem from sanctions imposed on Russia, as Russian firms are turning to Vietnam as a market and a source to import consumer goods.
Doanh nghiệp Việt Nam mình thì thật ra thì cũng sẽ có những cái nhu cầu nhập khẩu những cái mặt hàng ở thị trường Nga như kiểu mặt hàng thịt, mặt hàng sữa hoặc là những mặt hàng phân bón chẳng hạn, lúa mì, ảnh hưởng chính trị. Nên là thật ra thì Nga họ cũng muốn là tìm kiếm những đối tác mặt hàng mới thì Việt Nam sẽ chính là một trong những quốc gia như thế.
Mặc dù trong rất nhiều khó khăn và biến động thì dòng chảy hợp tác Việt-Nga vẫn luôn luôn mạnh mẽ, mà chúng ta sẽ chuẩn bị để xây dựng một cái hệ thống, các cái hệ sinh thái kết nối với nhau để tạo ra một cái tương lai lâu dài.
Russian Deputy Prime Minister is expected to visit some Russian firms at a trade show in Hanoi on Friday. He will also address Vietnamese students who are studying the Russian language before he departs Vietnam. Tùng Ngô, CNA, Hanoi.
And more than 5,000 people have been forced to flee to Thailand this week following fierce fighting between the Myanmar military and ethnic rebels. Reports say both sides have suffered heavy casualties. The exodus reportedly began when rebels in the southern Karen state attacked a military border guard outpost. The Thai authorities say the refugees, most of whom are ethnic Karens, have been crossing the Moy River into Thailand's Tak province. Those who have arrived in Thailand have been placed in temporary shelters set up by local residents. But a charity worker says there are people still waiting on the Myanmar side to cross, adding that many are running out of even drinking water. Fighting has raged in many rural areas across Myanmar. Rights groups have accused the military of targeting civilians in airstrikes and ground operations. At least 8 civilians were killed last week in an aerial attack on a village in northwest Myanmar. Thailand says its Air Force is monitoring the situation. It says that it's ready to send patrol flights if the country's airspace is violated.
It's time for a break, but still to come. A special guest joins the Muslim community as they break fast at Tekwai's Al Khair Mosque this evening. Plus, 2 in 5 family caregivers at risk of developing depression, according to a survey. We'll discuss what support can be given to aid them on their journey.
On the next stage of First, a new dawn in the land of the rising sun. The Bank of Japan ushers in a new era as Kazuo Ueda prepares to take the helm. We'll look at the incoming governor's tough balancing act as challenging times strain the central bank's long-standing ultra-loose policy.
Farm life is unpredictable.
The house burnt down on the 19th of December.
But just by listening to nature,
What a beauty, my first ever beehive.
we can reimagine the way we grow our food.
You know, you can imagine this place 10 years from now. It's just going to be amazing, lots of fruits, lots of food.
I'm going back to my roots.
You are your own scientist. Over time, you need to observe and see what works for you.
And rethinking the role of an urban farmer in Growing Wild tonight on CNA.
You can only hide secrets like this for so long.
Oh, look at this. Repatriation of Chinese seamen at Liverpool.
When the men disappeared, it was an awful thing to happen, and a lot of people suffered.
There are a lot of people in this country who don't know nothing about it. And that's a bloody disgrace.
He was targeted because he was a person of colour. This was her country, and yet they still had to leave.
They stood side by side with the Australians in the war, and they had just as much right to be in Australia as I did.
That 1 week in jail changed my father for the rest of his life. He wasn't a criminal. He just wanted to be with his wife and his children.
Watch The Exiles on demand at CNA.Asia.
My name is Douglas Lan. After my grandfather passed away,
my family received a mysterious envelope of cash from a clan association. What are these clans?
好，歡迎大家嚟到第165屆執監聯席會議。
呢啲係互相幫助，係以前嘅人一種我哋係冇得依靠嘅時代。
I meet young Singaporeans who take me on a quest to find out, are clans even relevant today?
他们很无助的时候，可以来会馆，他们感觉到有一个依赖啊。
廣州 is my second home， 甘能相照。Spend my childhood here, so I will continue spending my adulthood here as well.
Watch Remember Our House on demand at CNA.Asia.
This April, stay on top of your game and live life with purpose. Keep your wellness in check.
So much gluten in everything. How does dementia develop in Asians?
As we examine the path to live a healthier life on the pulse. Groundbreaking stories.
Ethnic armed conflict on Myanmar.
Fascinating insights and first-hand experiences. Get to know Asia from those who live and breathe the region.
More peace and quiet at Chenjuro Lake.
CNA correspondent.
Ooh, wow.
Embrace a greener life and discover earth-friendly ways of growing your own food.
Good.
The new season of Growing Wild. This April on CNA.
Male infertility on the rise.
More men are less shy about coming forward to get tested.
A telehealth service with discretion.
We tackle men's health conditions such as erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, hair loss, and mental health.
And mirrors in the gym. Friend or foe.
The mirror can be great motivation when you look right into it, but it's also a double-edged sword.
On the Pulse, Saturday on CNA.
One of our favorite desserts has been given a makeover.
That's how much kale there is in a pint of our chocolate kale ice cream.
Wow.
With labels like low calories, low sugar, vegan and keto.
Can we really indulge in ice cream without the guilt?
This was amongst one of the highest in fat content.
Talking Point, Sunday on CNA.
Employers could soon get a better idea of what their potential hires are like and what matters to them. Singapore Management University will introduce a transcript that not only documents students' co-curricular achievements, but also offers insights into the skill sets they developed in the process. The co-curricular transcript is a first year and will complement the academic transcript those graduating in 2025 will receive. The new transcript will break down students' efforts into 4 areas. These are intellectual and creative skills, interpersonal skills, global citizenship, and personal mastery. At the launch, SMU shared how students will document their learning experiences and reflections online. These will then be graded by staff advisors according to 3 levels of learning, with each level indicating a progressively more impactful experience. The transcript will also reflect the soft skills that were picked up during these activities.
So what this transcript does is it just renders visible all the amazing learning that they are doing in these activities. So instead of just saying, I have done 80 hours, the question is, what did you learn in that 80 hours? So we're bringing students on now a purposive journey.
Education Minister Chan Chun Sing says beyond academic results, having qualities such as the ability to discover, distill and discern will put Singaporeans ahead of the curve.
It's our ability to collaborate with others, and this will enable us to harness the diversity of our people and partners to create new value propositions. This is especially important in a fragmenting world and polarizing world, where we can stay ahead by connecting different people with different backgrounds, persuasions, and perspectives.
Employers also welcomed the idea of having a co-curricular transcript, as it allows them to bring in graduates based not just on their grades, but on their involvement in school as well.
Everyone wants to hire a person, not just a piece of paper. And I think a transcript like this helps us to see what is the human being behind just the grade. It tells us what kind of things are important to the person.
2 in 5 family caregivers are at risk of developing depression, particularly at a time of higher costs and worries around the pandemic. A survey by the Palliative Care Centre for Excellence in Research and Education found that the increase in cost of care was linked to a 10-fold jump in depression risk. And for more, we have with us Dr. Mervyn Koh. He's Medical Director at Dover Park Hospice. Good evening to you. Dr. Koh, caregiving for the elderly, it is physically and emotionally challenging. It's tough for those people who need to care for their family members specifically. But does it automatically put caregivers at a higher risk for developing depression?
Thanks for that question. I don't think it automatically puts them at a higher risk of depression. But in our study, I think we found that the groups that are at highest risk of depression are those who do not have that family support, be it in terms of practical assistance or emotional assistance. And that group of caregivers will be at increased risk of developing greater caregiver stress and burnout as well. We've also found in our study that caregivers who are single and who really do not have such a strong support network are more at risk of developing caregiver distress as well as burnout.
Dr. Koh, this study, the survey was carried out by the Palliative Care Centre, so I assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the caregivers were caring for those perhaps towards the end stages of their lives. Now, that in itself is depression causing, let alone having to care for them and to stay positive amidst a great deal of work when there's a great deal to feel very sad about. So in a way, to tell me 2 in 5 of caregivers of those needing palliative care are depressed, that is no surprise at all. In fact, I would expect the number to be even greater than that. If you look at the ripple-on effects of caregivers being depressed, what would those effects be?
I think, again, that's a great comment. It is true that for caregivers who are caring for loved ones with a terminal illness or an advanced life-limiting illness, they are already going through a lot emotionally. I think the purpose of this study is to bring this out to the fore, that we are aware that they are going through such a tough time. And if we do not take care of these groups of caregivers well, then firstly, the first thing to suffer would be their own mental health. And then consequently, it will be their inability to care for their loved ones. Another interesting finding from our study is that the average caregiver in the 200 caregivers we surveyed were actually people in their mid-40s to 60 years old, female, married, as well as holding down a full-time job. So if these caregivers are not well taken care of, and if they are burnt out, they won't be able to do their caregiving roles well, and they will not be able to perform their work, their full-time employment job well as well.
Dr. Koh, the role of a family caregiver may just come upon a designated family member without much preparation. And what I hear you say is that there needs to be better preparation. How can that be supported?
So you're absolutely right again to say that the role of caregivers sometimes is just trust upon a family member. And I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of raising awareness that actually there are courses available for caregivers the moment this comes upon them. Also, the other things that we hear from our study participants is that there needs to be perhaps ready financial assistance as well as advice even from healthcare providers about how to access these caregiver schemes, these caregiver causes, as well as this healthcare grants. I think it's a positive step ahead that I think our government has recognized the importance of the caregiver and has increased the home caregiver grant from $200 per month to even $400 per month as of March this year. Yeah, but certainly this is a work in progress. And I think as a society, we need to really pay more attention to the role of caregivers and to begin this conversation to see how we can better support them, because honestly, they're all around us. They could be, for many of us, our own loved ones, and for many of us, our neighbors and friends as well, who are going through these challenges and struggles.
Well, Dr. Koh, thank you very much for sharing your perspectives with us on the challenges for family caregivers. That was Dr. Mervyn Koh, their medical director at Dover Park Hospice. Thank you.
Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong joined the Muslim community in breaking fast at Chua Chu Kang this evening during the month of Ramadan. PM Lee was taken on a tour of the El Khai Mosque at Teck Whye Crescent. He was accompanied by Minister in charge of Muslim Affairs Masaugo Zulkifli and MUIS President Saad Abdul Rahman. He then joined over 300 congregants in breaking fast. Several MPs, grassroots and religious leaders were also present.
President Halimah Yacob will be delivering a speech in Parliament at 8:30 p.m. on Monday as the House returns from a midterm break. The address signals the opening of the second session of the country's 14th Parliament. Madam Halimah will outline the government's priorities, policies and programmes for the rest of its 5-year term that ends in 2025. MPs will then debate on them during the subsequent weeks. You can catch the speech live on Monday at 8:30 p.m. on CNA. And that's Singapore Tonight. Don't forget, headlines anytime at cna.asia.
Plus we're on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Good night.
Bye for now.
This April, stay on top of your game and live life with purpose. Keep your wellness in check.
So much gluten in everything.
How does dementia develop in Asians?
As we examine the path to live a healthier life on the pulse. Groundbreaking stories,
Ethnic armed conflict on Myanmar,
fascinating insights and first-hand experiences. Get to know Asia from those who live and breathe the region.
More peace and quiet at Chenjuro Lake.
CNA correspondent.
Ooh, wow.
Embrace a greener life and discover earth-friendly ways of growing your own food.
Good.
The new season of Growing Wild. This April on CNA.
This Saturday, how to invest in the next big trend in tech.
Generative AI will be impacting positively to every other potential industry that you can ever think of.
Managing your home loan as interest rates rise.
The biggest fear is how high can it go?
Plus how to maximize your travel budget despite rising costs. Money Mind, Saturday at 10:30 p.m.
We serve it. We love it. We thought bak kut teh was ours. But then, Malaysia claimed it and even said they named it.
bak kut teh 的名字就是我爷爷的名字演变成来。
Has Singapore been slurping up a Malaysian invention?
Wait. Singapore have a parallel history.
Food Fight, Sunday on CNA.
森の中に止まっているような雰囲気になってるんですね。
시간의 아름다움이랄까? 시간이 가지고 있는 깊이.
생명을 부여하는 듯한 그런 부분에 있어서는 이 작업을 통해서 어떤 이야기를 같이 공유하고
I don't think vinyl is dead. There's still people who love the magic behind his record.
Preserving a craftsmanship but also challenging it.
The patina actually shows the relationship, the history of the camera with the owner. It's like a love affair.
Jakarta's notorious traffic congestion is also a sign of growing prosperity for the capital's 10 million inhabitants. I'm Saiful Bahri Ismail, CNA, Jakarta.
This is Asia First.
It's 7 a.m. here in Singapore. I'm Julie Yu. The headlines this Friday morning. A series of airstrikes across Israel's northern and southern borders, raising the risk of a wider conflict in the region. The military blames the Palestinian group Hamas as tensions simmer at Jerusalem's most sensitive holy site.
Given the extreme seriousness of the situation, we urge restraint and we urge the parties to avoid any further escalation.
I'm Steve Lai, also this morning, delivering a united message to China amid Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. European leaders tell President Xi Jinping they are counting on Beijing to end the conflict, with Ursula von der Leyen taking a sterner line.
I'm Sarah Alcaldi with Business News. Wall Street wraps up a short trading week on a high note as investors look beyond a barrage of U.S. labor data, pointing to signs of a sputtering economy.
Getting up this hill would require major step changes.
The IMF's Kristalina Georgieva making a case for stronger action as the lender projects the weakest global growth outlook in more than 3 decades.
The fears of an escalation mounting in the Middle East after northern Israel was struck by several rockets reportedly fired from across the border in Lebanon.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged to retaliate against the attacks. Israeli forces have reportedly responded with several airstrikes against targets in the Gaza Strip. Witnesses have reported explosions in the Palestinian enclave.
Israel accused Palestinian militant group Hamas of firing 34 rockets from southern Lebanon into Israel. Hamas claims it has no information about who fired the missiles. The tensions are high after Israeli police raided and clashed with Palestinian worshippers in Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque twice in the past 2 days.
The Israeli Prime Minister called for calm amid the previous day's confrontations at the mosque, which Israel refers to as the Temple Mount. Mr. Netanyahu added that Israel will take strong action against what he describes as extremists. He then vowed to strike back at the rocket attack, promising to make the attackers pay the price for their acts of aggression.
The series of events prompted Mr. Netanyahu to discuss the worsening situation with his security cabinet. The United Nations, meantime, has condemned the rocket attack on Israel and called for restraint.
We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint. The UN interim force in Lebanon remains in contact with authorities on both sides of the blue line, and we urge the parties to liaise with our peacekeepers and avoid any unilateral action that could further escalate the situation.
Israel earlier said most of the rockets that were fired from Lebanon were intercepted, though 6 managed to hit Israeli territory. Rockets caused light damage to several buildings and left 2 people with minor injuries. Israeli officials say yesterday's attack is the largest salvo of rockets fired from Lebanese territory since its war against Hezbollah in 2006.
Well, the White House has blamed the previous Trump administration for the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan more than 1.5 years ago.
It says there were no signs that more time, more funds, or more Americans could have fundamentally changed what happened. This is among the findings in a 12-page report on Washington's unilateral move to pull out of the country. National Security spokesperson John Kirby defended President Joe Biden as having made the right decision.
The White House concedes there were intelligence failures and evacuations could have been earlier in situations where security was degrading. But it pinned responsibility squarely on the former Trump administration of not planning for a transition out of Afghanistan and deliberately degrading U.S. military presence, all of which it claims crippled President Biden's ability to respond.
You got to look at when he came into office, what he was walking into. He didn't negotiate with the Taliban. He didn't invite the Taliban to Camp David. He didn't release 5,000 prisoners. He didn't reduce force levels in Afghanistan to 2,500. And he didn't have an arrangement with the Taliban that they won't attack our troops. He came in with a certain set of circumstances. He had no ability to change. He had to deal with it based on what he inherited.
This was the last U.S. soldier to leave Afghanistan, capping a tumultuous time that saw the Taliban's lightning takeover of Kabul, preempting President Biden's original pull-out plan by a month. Many Afghans, especially those who worked with the Americans, crammed Kabul's airport in a desperate bid to flee with the U.S. military and allies, while security in Kabul collapsed as President Ashraf Ghani fled the country.
Things turned deadly when the ISIS suicide bomber attack killed 170 Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers. Despite all that, the White House says it can be proud of the operation.
Proud of the fact that we got more than 124,000 people safely out of Afghanistan? You bet. Proud of the fact that American troops were able to seize control of a defunct airport and get it operational in 48 hours? You bet. Proud of the fact that we now have about 100,000 Afghans, our former allies and partners, living in this country and working towards citizenship? You bet.
The report has been sent to Congress in Washington, D.C., where Benji Hire joins us from. Benji, how independent is this report, and how will Capitol Hill view it, especially since it comes so soon after Donald Trump was charged with criminal offenses?
Look, this was a culmination of months of work by individual agencies, but at the end of the day, it was published by the White House. It is the perspective through their lens, and it is sympathetic to their point of view, in a sense. That doesn't delegitimize its authenticity, but it does reinforce its purpose, that this report is not necessarily about accountability, but in the words of John Kirby, who you just heard, it's supposed to be about gaining an understanding of what happened in order to inform the future. A couple of key lines. It claims decisions that were made and the lack of planning done by Mr. Trump significantly limited Joe Biden's options. His choices, again I quote, were severely constrained by conditions created by his predecessor, whose team the report accuses of not coming up with a plan to help with that withdrawal. That criticism of Donald Trump and his administration will not be taken lightly by his allies in Congress, many of whom, at the time and since, have condemned Joe Biden's handling of the evacuation. Worth bearing in mind that the lawmakers that have for months pressured and requested this information had been provided a more in-depth, classified version than the 12-page document that the rest of us have had access to. And that is also the crux of another issue here, which is that reporters have highlighted towards John Kirby, towards the Biden administration, that what's required is greater transparency, that ultimately if Congress has access to this information, why not the rest of it? And also, why was it delivered in the manner in which it was? CBS News' Ed O'Keefe saying that this is the very definition of the modern major holiday news dump, a reference to the fact that this contents was given to us on the eve of Easter and during the Jewish festival of Passover. Was that intentional? Well, John Kirby insists that the nature and the date of its release does not signify any sort of effort to bury its contents.
Interesting, Benji. Well, thank you very much for that report, Benji Hire in Washington, D.C. In other news now, well, China is willing to engage with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on its war with Russia. That's according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen after she held talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, along with French President Emmanuel Macron in Beijing.
Ms. von der Leyen said President Xi's comments on the matter were positive. The EU and France, at the same time, also made clear that China must not support Russia's invasion.
As I reported, raised the point of arms deliveries. And I want to be very clear on that one, that arming the aggressor is a clear violation of international law. It's the aggressor, and he should never be armed. And this would indeed significantly harm the relationship between the European Union and China.
Mr. Xi told the EU leaders that a call with President Zelensky could happen when the conditions and timing are right. The Ukrainian president has repeatedly asked to meet with the Chinese leader following Mr. Xi's visit to Moscow last month. The Chinese leader also emphasized that he has peace and stability in mind.
中欧应当坚持对话和合作，维护世界和平稳定，促进共同的发展繁荣，推动人类文明进步，携手应对全球性挑战。
Both China and France, meantime, called for Russia-Ukraine peace talks to be held as soon as possible. Mr. Macron also urged President Xi to talk sense into Moscow.
Et je sais pouvoir compter sur vous, au titre d'ailleurs des deux principes que je viens d'évoquer, pour ramener la Russie à la raison et tout le monde à la table des négociations. Et nous y reviendrons dans le détail, mais nous avons besoin de retrouver une paix durable, c'est-à-dire une paix qui respecte les frontières internationalement reconnues et qui évite toute forme d'escalade. Et je crois que c'est aussi une question importante pour la Chine autant qu'elle l'est pour la France et pour l'Europe.
Olivia Xiong with more on the Chinese leader's response to Mr. Macron's appeal.
We know that even prior to this visit, Mr. Macron had placed the Ukraine war very high on his agenda, keen for China to use its influence over Russia to reign in Moscow. But we saw that Mr. Xi, in his opening remarks of that meeting, did not mention Ukraine. Also, he had this to say when both leaders met the media.
关于乌克兰危机，中方坚持劝和促谈，政治解决。中方愿同法方一道，呼吁国际社会保持理性克制，避免采取使危机进一步恶化甚至失控的行动。
Now, we know that China has adopted what is called a neutral position in this Ukraine war, and it's noteworthy in that Mr. Xi's comments to the media, he adopted very vague language, not mentioning Russia or Ukraine or other countries, even as he said that there was a need to ensure civilians would be protected and that nuclear weapons are not used. Also stopping short of condemning Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, as has been China's position in this past year. It's a contrast to Mr. Macron's statement that followed, in which he specifically said, for example, that Russia was violating humanitarian law in Ukraine. Also, it was telling that the French leader did say that while he agrees with a number of the principles that he had discussed with the Chinese side, that he hoped that in the very near future that there would be a much more demanding conversation between the two sides and with Russia, he said, to remind Moscow of these principles, that it's a matter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, perhaps pointing and signaling that Mr. Macron may have not solicited the kind of response or commitment that he was hoping for from the Chinese leader.
And just as the French president urged China to help mediate the Ukraine conflict, the Kremlin isn't keen for Beijing to do so and insists that the only way forward was to press on with its offensive.
The comments came as French President Emmanuel Macron urged his Chinese counterpart to reason with Russia. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that while China has an effective and commanding potential for mediation, the situation with Ukraine is complex and there are no prospects for a political settlement at this point in time. Beijing has outlined a proposal for peace in Ukraine, but the plan remains vague.
Moscow has defended its decision to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, claiming that it's merely a response to NATO's expansion towards Russia.
НАТО расширяется в сторону границ России. Не Россия приближается своей инфраструктурой военной к границам НАТО. Идет движение в обратную сторону. Это движение доставляет нам хлопоты и переживания за нашу безопасность. Переживая за нашу безопасность, естественно, мы принимаем меры для того, чтобы ее обеспечить. И каждый раз, когда НАТО приближается в сторону наших границ, для того, чтобы снова сбалансировать всю архитектуру безопасности на континенте.
Russian President Vladimir Putin met with his Belarusian counterpart to discuss the topic of security and defense. Their opening public remarks steered clear of the conflict in Ukraine, despite Belarus's call for an immediate ceasefire last week.
President Alexander Lukashenko described the talks as productive and that the two were able to reach an agreement on all issues discussed. The Russian leader added there would be close work on boosting cooperation between both countries.
Большое значение имеет вынесенный на повестку дня заседания рассмотрения и рассмотренный сегодня вопрос о начале подготовки концепции безопасности союзного государства. В этом документе имеется в виду сформулировать основополагающие задачи нашего взаимодействия в сфере растущей напряженности на внешних границах наших государств и развязанной против нас санкционной и информационной войны.
But still ahead, U.S. investors catch their breath ahead of more economic data that could offer clues on the Fed's next steps. And that's just as the IMF says the world is on track for its weakest growth in more than 3 decades, as higher interest rates bite.
Farm life is unpredictable.
The house burnt down on the 19th of December.
But just by listening to nature,
what a beauty, my first ever beehive.
We can reimagine the way we grow our food.
You know, you can imagine this place 10 years from now. It's just going to be amazing, lots of fruits, lots of food.
I'm going back to my roots.
You are your own scientist. Over time, you need to observe and see what works for you.
And rethinking the role of an urban farmer in Growing Wild tonight on CNA.
Cryptocurrency prices crash, DeFi companies blow up, NFT scam, GameFi hack, fraud, and the metaverse land bust. I've always wondered, is there something more behind the headlines? Web 1 and 2 have already changed how we live, work, and play. What happens when the next evolution is powered by a host of new values and technologies?
Web3 is one of the most important inventions for Asian artists.
How can we rescue Taiwan IT industry? I cannot see any solution than Web3.
Thailand missed out on the Web2 boat totally.
Now we are the fastest move in action.
I don't think we know what the next $1 trillion businesses will be, but they are absolutely coming.
Join me as I learn from builders in Asia, building real use cases in real life.
And the love so deep we cannot measure. Ain't nobody loves me better. Makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better than you.
Male infertility on the rise.
More men are less shy about coming forward to get tested.
A telehealth service with discretion.
We tackle men's health conditions such as erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, hair loss, and mental health.
And mirrors in the gym, friend or foe.
The mirror can be great motivation when you look right into it, but it's also a double-edged sword.
On The Pulse, Saturday on CNA.
We serve it. We love it. We thought bak kut teh was ours. But then, Malaysia claimed it and even said they named it.
Bak kut teh 的名字就是我爷爷的名字演变成来。
Has Singapore been slurping up a Malaysian invention?
Wait. Singapore have a parallel history.
Food Fight, Sunday on CNA.
You're watching Asia First. Wall Street's 3 major indices closed out a holiday-shortened week on a positive note, despite more signs of a weakening labor market. Tech led the gains, with the Nasdaq outperforming the other majors. The Dow closed just above the flat line, as the S&P 500 also closed in the green. Stocks had started the session on the back foot, with jobless claims coming in higher than expected. Data for the week ended April 1st showed claims totaled 228,000. The report comes a day ahead of March's non-farm payrolls count, which is expected to show another slowdown in the U.S. labor market. That's likely to bolster bets of the Fed hitting the brakes on its fastest interest rate hiking cycle since the 1980s. And that's as the International Monetary Fund called on global central banks to carry on their inflation battles by hiking interest rates. This is despite growing concerns about financial stability. The recent turmoil in the financial sector has cast a shadow on the global tightening cycle meant to tackle rising prices.
At this point, on the balance, we see the risk of abandoning the fight against inflation, also one that has to be considered carefully, because inflation has proven to be stickier, especially core inflation. And that is a problem for return to more robust growth that has to be taken seriously.
The IMF has warned that the world could be headed for its weakest near-term growth in more than 3 decades. It flagged increased downside risks due to a series of bank failures in the U.S. and Europe. That's on top of high interest rates and geopolitical divisions. The lender expects global economic growth to expand by less than 3% this year and remain around that level for the next 5 years. That's the lowest medium-term growth forecast since 1990. Now, the IMF will publish its official report next week. Let's get more market insights from Todd Jablonski. He's Chief Investment Officer at Principal Asset Management, joining us from Seattle. Thanks for your time today, Todd. And now it's really about the jobs data that will come out of the U.S. What are you looking for? What are you hoping to see?
Well, indeed, the jobs data has really been at the forefront of investors' mind as high-frequency macro data has begun to inform investors that indeed the U.S. economy is slowing. We've seen it in the trajectory of earnings. We've seen it in the pace of economic development. And I don't envy the job of central bankers today at the Fed. They face a tough decision between price stability that comes from low levels of inflation and financial stability that comes from a banking system and other financial actors that are well capitalized and positioned to face the stresses of today's markets. Putting those two reasons together, or those two challenges together, I think the Fed's going to err on the side of inflation control. And our expectations are that we'll see 2 more Fed tightenings this year. And in all likelihood, the U.S. could enter recession in the 4th quarter of 2023.
And that's really where this market volatility is coming from, isn't it, Todd? Where investors are trying to figure out what's more worrying, a case where you've got a recession, but the Fed pauses or cuts rates, or on the other hand, you can have some economic momentum, but rates stay elevated. For you, what is a more worrying scenario, and what are you preparing against?
Our preparations and how we're positioning our multi-asset portfolios today is really centered around the price stability element. And I think the Fed has to squarely say we accept the risk of managing price control and really looking through to see what kind of volatility happens. Now, when you see the Fed tighten, something usually breaks. And throughout history, it can be often difficult to pinpoint what might break. But what you do find is the stresses become manifest. It's our view that you can see within some of the stresses within the financial sector a couple of isolated incidents, really, in terms of the kinds of banks that were impacted. At the same time, you've seen European regulators really clarify how they'll approach the AT1 capital relative to the needs of equity investors. I think that calmed the markets. And at the same time, you do see some of the finance debt spreads actually at very attractive levels. So in fact, I do think you can see the U.S. achieve a soft landing despite those two balances, but it will require, I think, confidence in investors that we can achieve, I think, the level of interest rate stability that will allow for the earnings to come that drive valuations.
Yeah, you mentioned that you're expecting some kind of soft landing for the U.S. economy, but what will that look like for the market? What will a soft landing scenario look like for U.S. markets and earnings?
Well, investors on both sides, I've seen some pundits call for hard landing, some pundits call for no landing at all. But our analysis, I think, indicates that you could see a shallow recession in the U.S. and on a global basis, perhaps one that only lasts 6 to 9 months. In fact, the imbalances that were around in 2008 and 2009, both on a debt level and in terms of stretching, in terms of the quality of debt, You don't see those kinds of imbalances today. So I think investors can look around and at the landscape and say that while we're having slowing economic activities and while we're arresting that inflation, there is the potential for this juggernaut of an economy to slow at a rate that allows for a soft landing, that allows for the kind of capital creation to happen, for investors to succeed without necessarily the panic and some of the, I think, high volatility we saw in 08-09.
All right, and this week, Todd, we saw investors flock to safety, bonds becoming more popular again. Where can investors hide?
Well, as we look across our asset class positioning, we're underweight equities, overweight fixed income and alternatives. And for global investors, I think taking another look at fixed income is a wise decision in 2023. A lot of the fixed income categories that last year really struggled to offer stability or income, and in 2023, they're positioned to potentially deliver attractive levels of return at reasonable levels of risk. That's why a core fixed income, treasuries, investment-grade corporates and mortgages in dollar terms may be attractive to global investors seeking to achieve some level of predictive stability from fixed income in an environment where equities face challenges both on the fundamental side and on the valuation front.
And really quickly, before I let you go, Todd, I know you like China and EM equities, but if the U.S. goes into a recession, even a shallow one, wouldn't that be a lot of pain for Asia and for where we are in this part of the world?
Well, no doubt there are significant trade and investment linkages across the Pacific. But when you look at China and you look at some of the opportunities that it presents, something like 14% earnings growth likely in 2023 by consensus estimates versus just 1% in the U.S. And in fact, as you look across Asia, across Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, you see double-digit earnings growth projections. I think that speaks to a lot of the strength that's coming out of the reopening story in China. And despite potential slowness in the U.S., economic surprise to the positive in China with inflation surprise to the negative in China leads us to be optimistic on that equity category.
Well, thanks for your time today, Todd. Have a good long weekend there. Todd Jablonski, Chief Investment Officer at Principal Asset Management. And I'll be back with more business updates in the next hour. You can get business updates across all of our CNA platforms here on Asia First TV, on radio CNA 938, and on digital CNA.asia/business. Julie and Steve.
Sarah, thank you very much. Coming up on Asia First, the French President Emmanuel Macron and EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen are calling on Beijing to help talk sense into Moscow in a bid to stop its conflict with Ukraine. Can China truly broker peace between the two countries? We speak with Lily McElwee, a fellow in the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, in a moment.
A delegation of U.S. officials led by House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul is now in Taiwan, despite warnings from Beijing against growing relations between Washington and Taipei.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.